Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you for being here. I understand that some of you are here under duress and that this is just a checkbox. And of course, it's spring fever, a few weeks to graduation for some maybe, and summer break for others. So I understand that that's part of the dynamic here in the room. I want to tell you a story about a young boy who enters a barber shop, and the barber whispers to his customer and says, "This is the dumbest kid in the world. Let me show you." And he takes $1 and he puts it in one hand and 2 quarters in the other hand, and he offers it to the kid and says, "Pick one." And the kid takes the 2 quarters and walks away. And the barber says to his customer, "See, I told you, that's the dumbest kid in the world." The customer kind of wondered about that, and then he goes out later and he sees the kid on the street. He's licking an ice cream cone that he had just purchased with the 2 quarters. So he says, "Hey, kid, come here. I got a question for you." And, "Sure. Why'd you take the 2 quarters and not the $1? The kid looks at him and says, "The moment I take the $1, the game's over." Now, I tell that story partly because I think it's good to start with a joke, sometimes, at least warm things up. I hope I find a way to work it into the talk later on, but I haven't figured that part out yet. So, but it might come in there. I like to throw ideas out and play with them. So when I was asked to come, I thought, okay, yeah, I'll go do a chapel. I don't come from a background where chapel is sort of a required activity at the university. But I said, sure, I'll do it. And I had a little bit of sense of it. So I thought, well, what could I talk about? I just did a quick Google on Tabor's website, and I saw the mission, preparing people for a life of learning, work, and for service to Christ and his kingdom. I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm really interested in a theology of work. I have started teaching a class with a business professor who's an accountant, actually, and we called it What is Business For? And we look at how work is structured and organized within our society and what's really the purpose of work and how we go about doing our work. Okay. So I thought, all right, that's a good thing. I have some ideas from that class that I might be able to incorporate in. But I wanted to connect it with the mission that you have here at Tabor. Right? And so I teach in the theology department. We have very few number of theology majors. And I think people who are sort of professionally religious, that's a good thing. They have an obligation to carry out mission. But mission is not really the burden simply of the professionally religious. Right? Mission is the burden of each one of us active and engaged in the world. Right? So nurses are carrying out the mission. Educators, teachers are carrying out the mission by the way they engage their students. Farmers are carrying out mission by the way they care for the land and their fields and the way they feed hungry people. Right? Social workers, by the way they address the needs and concerns of whoever they're speaking with and working with. Right? Whatever field you find yourself in, right? Businessmen and women are engaged with organizing work in a way that serves the community, serves the common good in some fashion. And so it's important to recognize that all of us participate in mission in some real way, and we either further it or we detract from it by our actions. So I want to reflect on the meaning and purpose of work, and we first meet this concept when we go into the book of Genesis. All right, Genesis starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a formless wasteland. Darkness covered the abyss, and a mighty wind swept over the waters. Right? Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God separated the light from the dark. He called the light day, the dark night. Evening came, morning followed the first day. Right? So we just start with that story, and it's talking about the creation of the earth, which is described as a formless wasteland and this kind of chaotic abyss that the wind is sweeping over. Now, what is something that is formless? When we use that word formless, what do we mean? I was warned that nobody was going to answer my questions, but I'm going to ask anyway. What does it mean to be without form? Okay. It lacks shape, right? There's no shape, there's no structure, there's no differentiation. It's just this, well, even a blob is a shape, so it's not even a blob. Right? It's undefined, okay? Formless. And wasteland. Wasteland is something barren, empty, and lifeless. So when God creates, it's an action by which that chaotic, lifeless, undifferentiated whatever, God is beginning to organize it, bringing order out of chaos. And that's an easy way to think of what's happening in Genesis chapter 1. God putting order into chaos. Right? I try to get my kids to do this with their rooms. It doesn't always work. Right? You need to put order into this chaos because it's a mess and you can't find anything. So God begins this process. And if you look at the story, the first 3 days of creation are simply God putting things in order, right? Separating light from dark, waters above from waters below, and dry land from the sea. And so we get this story of God organizing things, right? And bringing stuff into relationship with each other that makes sense when you think about it in the long run. So this process of creation is simply separation, right? And so now we have structure, we have form where it was previously formless. And then the next 3 days are 3 days of population. What was lifeless is now becoming filled with life. So on the fourth day, corresponding to the first day, if we had light and dark on the first day and the fourth day, we get the sun, moon, and stars, which populate the regions of light and dark. On the fifth day, we get birds and fish, right? Birds down here, fish up there. Whoops. Other way, right? Birds filling the sky, fish filling the sea. And then dry land on the third day corresponds with the creation of human beings, or with animals and then human beings. Right? So we have a very deliberate, well thought out kind of process by which creation happens. And so we think of how is God creating here. We see it's by the power of the word, right? God speaks the word, light, and light happens, right? Because in Hebrew, word and event are the same thing. When God says light, it happens and light comes about. We also have this wind hovering over the waters, right? And the word in Hebrew for wind is connected with the word for spirit, right? So the Spirit of God helping to order creation. And within the Christian understanding, God, the Father, speaking the Word, and the Spirit, we get the Trinity involved in some fashion. Now, with the creation of human beings, they're specifically described as having been made in the image of God. And so we want to think, what does it mean to say we've been made in the image of God? Well, the image of God includes this idea of knowledge, of being able to think about and understand the world in which we live, reflect on it, ask questions. It also includes the ability to act, to choose, to exercise our will to do something or to not do something. Right? So there's freedom being expressed there. And we're given a specific task or tasks to be fruitful, to subdue, to have dominion. And we've got to be careful because those words can often be misused. Subdue and dominion can be particularly dangerous. We'll come back to that. On the seventh day, it says, God completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day from all the work he had undertaken, blessed it, and made it holy. Now, do you think God was tired after 6 days of dictating things? You go here, you go there. Is that tiring work? Was God exhausted and needed a day off? Okay. So we have to ask, why is this story of the Sabbath rest put into the creation accounts? Right? What is it there for? And part of it is that the Sabbath reminds us that our human living is not simply about the work in the temporal world in which we live. We're called to something higher. We're called to a purpose where we can sit and rest and contemplate how all of this fits together. And the 6 days for work is important, right? We need to be able to work in order to provide for ourselves and so forth, but it's more than just that. So human fulfillment is not simply found in this life, but called to eternal life with God, and the Sabbath is the sign of that. Now, we move on in the story in Genesis 2, and we get specifically, the Lord God formed out of the dust of the ground the man and blew into his nostrils the breath of life. Then God took the man, settled him in the garden to care and cultivate it. Okay. So here we're getting that parallel to what came earlier about subdue and have dominion. Right? It's coupled with this idea of caring and cultivating. And I'm a gardener. I like to work in the soil, and it takes a lot of work to make the soil have the conditions necessary for fertility, for growth, right? And there's threats that come in, and you have to deal with those potential threats in various ways. Okay, so human beings are given this task of caring and cultivating the garden, expressing their understanding, their freedom in and through what they're doing here. And God says to the man, you are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What does that little except mean? When God says, accept this, what's just happened to human freedom? A little louder? Okay, it's given boundaries. It's limited, right? Human freedom is not absolute freedom in the way that God's freedom is, but it's real freedom, right? We have the power to work and change the world in which we live. Okay, so freedom within limits. So creation is given to us as a gift for our use, but also it's a task that we have to care and cultivate, right? Not to abuse, misuse, or exploit. And this task given to human beings is what distinguishes us from the rest of creation. In the Book of Wisdom, which is a book that Catholics put in their Bibles, and a lot of the Protestant tradition considers it part of the Apocrypha, but Solomon prays a prayer there that's very important and very insightful. He says, God of my fathers, Lord of mercy, you have made all things by your word, and by your wisdom have established humankind to rule the creatures produced by you, to govern the world in holiness and justice, and to render judgment in integrity of heart. Give me then wisdom, the attendant at your throne, and reject me not from among your children. Right? Solomon recognizes the unique role of the human person in terms of carrying on this work of creation, right? Participating in what God is doing by using our minds, using our wills to help further these things. Now, the story continues, and I just want to, I'm looking at the time here and amazed at how quickly it's going, at least for me. And we get to the third chapter, and we see Adam and Eve disobey that command, right? And there's effects that come with that, right? And the four, I call them four key relationships that everyone has: relationship with God, with others, with themselves, and with creation, right? All of those relationships become disordered, right? God brought order out of chaos. Sin reverses that process. It brings disorder where order should be, right? And so Adam and Eve's disobedience brings about a return to the chaos that existed prior, right? And so that's the problem. But in the Christian story, Jesus' obedience overcomes the disobedience of Adam, right, and Eve. And so we get stories in the New Testament where, well, let's start with the Old Testament here. The effects of Adam and Eve's sin is first they're hiding from God in the garden, right? God comes and says, where are you? Why are you hiding? And then they start to tell why, and they're hiding from each other behind fig leaves, and they start to blame each other. Right? Adam's response, it was the woman, and you put her here. Right? It's her fault. It's your fault because you put her here with me. I'm just a guy. Don't hold me responsible. And so you see this breaking up of relationships, this alienation that's occurring and creeping in, where people are protecting themselves over and against the other in some fashion. And that's not the way that God wanted it to be. And so in the New Testament, what do we have? We have Jesus reconciling people with God and with each other, bringing them into a community called the church, where they learn to bear one another's burdens and to help each other out, and potentially to reach out and welcome everyone in the human family into this community. Okay. And we find the disease and death that is part of the disorder that comes from sin. Well, the resurrection is a pledge of our own participation in the resurrection at the end of time. And so all of that is part of the healing that Jesus brings about. And even creation, which in the Old Testament was cursed, the ground is cursed, yielding thorns and thistles instead of ripe figs and vines. Well, in the New Testament, Jesus is turning water into wine. He's multiplying bread. He's stilling storms. Creation is responding to the gift that Jesus is bringing of reordering and recreating things. Okay, so that brings us to looking at work more specifically. In Catholic social teaching, Catholic social tradition, which is really just a long way of saying the whole history of thinking about the Bible in relation to human problems, particularly social problems, work plays a significant role. And it's understood in terms of a kind of threefold purpose to work, right? There's work as the principal means of meeting our material needs. There's work as an expression of who we are in terms of our ability to create and give self-expression and self-realization. And work contributes to the communities in which we live. And each one of those pieces is important in terms of how we think about work. So I want to talk about this question of what am I working for, right? And there's really just there's three takeaways to this, this presentation today. We can think of work as a job, we can think of work as a career, and we can think of work as a vocation. Right? If I think of work as a job, I'm thinking of it in terms of extrinsic motivation, right? Why do I work? Well, I work so I can get a paycheck. I work because I'm not interested in the work itself. I'm only interested in exchanging it to get stuff, right? Money or what money can buy, right? And again, that's important. We have material needs that we have to fulfill somehow, but that's not the only reason why we should be working. So the motivation for work as a job is this sort of sense of work outside. As students, right, your work right now is studying, but why are you studying? You may be simply doing it from extrinsic motivation, right? I'm doing it to get a grade. I'm doing it to get a degree. I'm doing it to get some item to put on my CV, right, so that I can get out and get a job. So I'm not studying because I want to understand the material. I'm studying simply because I have to get through this class in order to get the next step on my journey, right? Probably not the best reason to be studying, though somewhat understandable. Secondly, work as a career. Here, the motivation moves to internal concerns, right? I'm doing the work because I find fulfillment in it. I'm doing the work because it gives me pleasure in the process of doing this. It's an expression of my self-esteem, my creativity. It's personally satisfying. But the danger here is that my identity can become the work that I am doing. And I might even become a workaholic where I'm pursuing my work at the expense of other human goods and spiritual goods that ought to be part of my life, right? And so we talk about that work-life balance, right? But it's not just simply about that. Work as a job, work as a career is really too small in terms of our human needs. It's not that we don't need a job. It's not that we don't want a career. It's that cannot really fulfill us as human beings in the end. So work as a vocation is when we begin to think of work in that much larger perspective. It's this idea of connecting our work with our purpose in life, which ultimately is to be human. And to be human means to engage with the world in which we live It includes the call to love, the call to holiness, the call to be whole. It's a way of being in the world. And so when our work is integrated with who we are as persons, we find that kind of meaning and purpose that we need. It's understood as an aspect of how I live out faithful discipleship. It flows from being made in the image of God. Okay? It's rightly ordered. It exercises our minds and our wills in order to care and cultivate whatever field or endeavor we've been given. Okay? In a manner that honors God, our neighbor, and our own integrity. And so that brings us back to this idea of the Sabbath and contemplation, right? To be completed, the seventh day was the day when God completed the work of creation, right? Where our work is lifted into its higher purpose because it is no longer simply an exchange of labor for a reward, no longer simply that it gives me pleasure in some fashion, but it becomes a way of being in the world and how our gifts become service to others, and by which we realize what it means to be human, what it means to be made in the image of God.